Hello and welcome to the program. My name is Luke Hunt and this is another podcast for The Diplomat. And with me today is Charlotte McDonald Gibson, who has a new book out, Far Out it's called, and it's all about terrorism, the minds of young people, particularly those in Western countries who have succumbed to violent extremists around the world. Charlotte, welcome to the program.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Lee.
Tell me about the start of the book. Where did the genesis come from and how did you get going?
Well, my speciality in the past has really been writing about different sort of issues linked mostly to sort of human rights and migration, and in particular refugee issues. So my first book, Castaway, was about the refugee crisis, and it told the story of 5 people who'd arrived in Europe over the last few years to really sort of weave in the political context, the refugee crisis, the human stories of the refugee crisis. So this really was what my background was in. It was sort of looking at people perceived to be the victims of these times in which we live, with economic crisis, with increase in hate speech, with, all increase in extremism. So it was all these kind of reasons.
Yep.
But then in around in exactly March 2016, I was caught up in the bombings in Brussels airport, in which 19 people were killed by 3 Islamist extremists. And sort of in the aftermath of that, I remember being quite shaken by this event, but it really started to make me think about how we look at the world we live in today and the problems in which the world we live in today. And it was sort of thinking about, well, I've written about it from one side, about the side of the perceived victims of the times in which we live, but then I was interested in looking at the other side, because I don't think we can really assess the issues that have gone wrong in our societies unless we look at the other side and the people who are the perpetrators of these kind of hateful acts and try and unpick how somebody got to that point, went down that path to extremism. And so that was really the catalyst for me to think, well, I need to look at both sides. I need to try and understand the other side as well in order to make sense of these very difficult times in which we live.
You've done a very good job of it too, I might add. When it comes to terrorism, counter-terrorism, which is, they're not always great titles, including war on terrorism, I might add, but we tend to think of ISIS, Al-Qaeda. In Southeast Asia, it was Jemaah Islamiyah, JI, then JAT, which replaced it later on. But you've kind of delved into the backgrounds of 8 people from very, not just Western backgrounds. I mean, they all grew up in or migrated to Western countries from across Europe to Australia. And they all have very individual stories to tell how they wound up where they did. What surprised me about most of them is that they actually had very strong characters.
I think what I was definitely trying to do was give people a fresh perspective, really, because we all have our preconceptions of who or what an extremist is.
Sure.
You discussed there quite a few examples of Islamist extremism in different countries in Asia, for example. So, we often view extremism through this very securitized lens. So we think about terrorism, violent extremism, the threat, how can we deal with it from a security perspective? And I think a lot of governments have really focused on that. But we're not really going to tackle the issue unless we look at the whole circumstances that lead people to that point where they choose to go down that path towards extremism and at the far end towards violent extremism, the terrorist groups that you're talking about there.
Yep.
So that was the idea, to really sort of break it down, to try and get rid of that ideological perspective. So that was why I chose these 8 individuals who are from across different ideologies, and not just different ideologies, different countries, different sort of generations. So we have everything from a Norwegian woman from an aristocratic family who ended up in a Marxist cult in the 1980s,
yeah.
all the way through to a young boy, or a young English kid who went to Syria to fight with the al-Nusra Front linked to Al-Qaeda. So by sort of stripping away those, having a book focused only on Islamist extremism or jihadi brides or the far right or neo-Nazis, the idea is to really find what the commonalities are in those individuals that transcend the ideology. And that is what I found absolutely fascinating researching. It was how many times these similarities, these commonalities came out in the strangest of ways sometimes. And it really made you see that just focusing on, here's this ideology, let's stop this person being an Islamist terrorist, that isn't going to solve the problem. That's just the tip of the iceberg. You really need to pull right back to the broader societal problems if we're really going to address extremism in our societies today.
I think you did a terrific job when you have characters like Tom Olsen and, pardon me if my pronunciations are wrong, but Matt
Kapitanovich.
Yeah, thank you.
Kapitanovich.
But, I mean, these guys were sort of far-right neo-Nazis, and I still felt dreadfully sorry for them. And speaking as a rapidly approaching old man, you kind of do think that they're all very young. They all want more out of life. None of them have lived very long, so they haven't got that much, which I think is always a mistake of young people's expectations. But one of the common problems I kind of took away from the book was that they needed individual attention. They weren't being listened to. They did have needs, and there just didn't seem to be anyone there for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you say about sort of feeling that empathy for them is really interesting, because I did as well, especially this idea of being young and that really strong feeling you have, in your teens and even into your early 20s, where you really want to have some sort of impact on the world. You want to matter. You want your voice to matter. And there's that real sort of sense of rage, and you feel these feelings of injustice so strongly. I really remember that from being a teenager. I think I was sort of really quite militant about animal rights, and, I was so angry, and I wanted to go and protest and throw stones at cattle trucks and all these kind of things. I remember those feelings so strongly. And I think back to those days, and what if there had been somebody who'd sort of spotted that in me and decided to exploit those feelings that I had? I mean, I could have ended up on one of those tracks. So I think it's really important that we recognize the universality of these kind of feelings that are so easy to exploit. So I think that was really key. And this idea of feeling powerless, of feeling voiceless, that came across so strongly. And I think that's getting worse, I think, as we have this more of a disconnect as well between government and people. And I think that's universal across many, many countries around the world, that you have this disconnect, you have growing inequality. So you have all these societal issues which aren't getting any better, which are contributing to extremism. So that doesn't bode very well for the future unless we start to address these issues.
Who are your favourites? Do you have any?
Well, I think it's interesting, the people that I felt the most commonality with. Yeah. And maybe it's obvious to say that the two women in the book, definitely, because that's Catherine, the Norwegian woman that I spoke about, who ended up being recruited into a Marxist cult in the 1980s. Again, when she talked about her childhood, she talked about being a teenager and watching sort of Live Aid on the television and being so moved by the Ethiopian famine and like the sense of injustice that she felt like she couldn't do anything about it. It was, all of that came from such a good place. She really wanted to have a positive impact on the world. And this is what this recruiter is. In this case, it was one very manipulative individual who really recruited her into this cult, which is obviously a different process to somebody radicalizing online, which is, we can talk about that a bit more later. But see how those feelings that I felt I had too were manipulated. For me, it really struck a chord. And the same with the other woman in the book, Hadia Masaya. She ended up joining the Islamist extreme group Hizb ut-Tahrir. And again, she came from that same place. And what I found was fascinating was that both her and Catherine had cited Live Aid and the Ethiopian famine as being this key event in their lives, which had really opened their eyes to injustice elsewhere. But whereas, they've both gone down such different paths. And I think that really illustrated how similar the motives can be. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that Live Aid turned loads of people into extremists, but the point is that there's this confluence of all these different reasons, these external reasons, internal reasons, all coming together at a pivotal point in this person's life. So it's a set of circumstances that has to happen. But it's so interesting to see those commonalities and just to see those, to feel that understanding and that sort of commonality between them. So I would say they were the ones I felt most in tune with their stories.
Right. Being of a similar vintage to Catherine and Hadia, I also remember the Live Aid concert very, very well. I also remember studying genocide as a subject, part of a subject, last year of high school. And then as we're finishing up, when we got word about Pol Pot and the slaughter of 3 million people, and it was kind of, Live Aid came on, it was a few years later, but this was all kind of, your book looks at the last 20 years. That period was very stark in my mind as well. And Live Aid made an enormous difference. In fact, I think it had a much bigger impact than, say, Woodstock. And it really did carry at the time. Yeah. Peter Sitonovic. He's an interesting one. He just seems a bit like bit of a loose nut as a teenager, which is, a lot of teenagers are. And one photograph, and he's kind of... Take us into Peter's story, because there's a bit more to it than just one photograph.
Yeah, Peter's story is very interesting. So, just to sort of maybe trigger the memories of your listeners, I mean, Peter Sagatonovich is the young man whose photograph was taken at the Charlottesville protest in West Virginia, and that was the protest at which a young anti-racist activist was killed. And there's this very famous photo of Peter sort of screaming. It was a torchlight protest the night before, full of white nationalists, openly neo-Nazi people, Ku Klux Klan members, the most horrible mix of very angry young men. And his photograph was taken sort of screaming, looking absolutely full of rage. So he essentially became the face of the far right. And his picture is still used all the time. On Twitter, an article is published about far-right nationalists. You'll see Peter's picture. There he is, holding his tiki torch, screaming, come up. So he has become shorthand, for the phenomena of, especially sort of white nationalism entering the mainstream, because, his head isn't shaved. He looks like your college schoolboy next door sort of neighbour type of thing. Yeah. But his story is fascinating because he's gone through this very difficult process of trying to work out what he's done wrong, not fully understanding it, wanting to do the right thing, trying to do the right thing, then making mistakes and getting it wrong, and then getting very angry and getting very confused. I mean, his journey is basically incredibly human. It's such a human journey of sort of thinking, well, I've made a mistake. How do I make up for that mistake? Mm-hmm. And he has done lots of things right to try and make up for this mistake. He's worked with, because he's American, but he ended up studying in London at LSE soon after for various reasons. So he ended up working for a counter-extremism organisation in London, run by a former Islamist extremist, to try and work building bridges in the local communities and things. He has reached out to sort of anti-racism organisations in the United States to try and work with them. So he's done a lot right. But he struggles to fully understand what he did wrong. So it's very much a process. But the way that the world is so polarized right now, people won't give him a chance to say he's sorry. So he's really, really struggling in his life now. He can't get a job. He can't get into university. So it's kind of like, well, you have to be perfect. So this very human journey that he's going through, which people who work in extremism say is completely normal. You don't de-radicalize overnight. This idea that suddenly, I made a mistake. Now I know exactly what my mistake was. I know how to put it right. I'm going to be a perfect, liberal, ideal person from this point. That is completely unrealistic. But that is the expectation that society places on people, especially people from the far right. So he's been really struggling. And I find his story, his story is fascinating because it reflects the complexity of being a human being. But it seems in this sort of polarized world, we're not afforded the ability to be a complex human being anymore. We have to be one thing or another. It has to be black or white with nothing in between. So for me, that story really illustrated the problems with looking at the world like that.
Sure. And if that photograph was never taken, no one would know who he was. He may well have changed and carried on the way he is now, but at the same time, the vilification that came with that one photograph is quite extraordinary. And one of the reasons I'm asking this is because he is from the far right. And ask a dirty question, does the extreme left, get an easier ride than, say, the far right, when both of them can be guilty of the same sins? And I ask that where you've got Shane Hunter and Toby Cook. I think that's a great example of both sides of the political spectrum. But when youth acts up, when youth protests and they're from the left, which is kind of the experience that carried on for decades, it's, the adult attitude was always, well, that's what they do at university kind of thing. But the far right, no one ever cuts them any slack, which I suspect goes all the way back to World War II. But are there some sort of real prejudices built in there? Should people who are saying, oops, I went into the far right, give me a go, please? It's a little bit different than coming from the left.
Oh, absolutely. There has been a sort of systematic downplaying of far left extremism and far left violence over the past decade, and I think that's problematic. The reason why it is the case, there is more deaths linked to far right violent extremism than there is to the far left. I mean, the statistics are very, very clear. They're in the book, but, You don't tend to get the mass shootings like you got in Buffalo, just in New York State, just on Saturday, when 10 people were killed in a racially motivated shooting. That doesn't tend to happen on the far left. So there is a reason why there has been more of a focus on the far right, and a valid reason. But you can't just ignore the fact that there is this very extreme far left violence as well, because that is fueling these sort of cycles of mistrust, these cycles of violence. I mean, you used the example there of Toby and Shane in Australia, and I found their story very interesting because they were both on different sides and they were just fueling each other. So they just had both the far left and the far right would just turn up at these rallies and basically have a bit of a ruckus, and then off they go. And sort of any ideological goals were sort of thrown out the window on either side. It was just really about having a bit of a go at each other.
Punch up and a laugh.
Yeah. But I think that it's about media coverage as well. It's about the media coverage of it, and I think that it depends on which media you're looking at as well. If you look in the US, you have that very skewed far right sort of media set who would really go against the sort of Antifa far left in there. So it sort of depends on what media you're reading will give a sort of different impression. But yeah, I think the far left hasn't had enough coverage. It needs more attention. And if you look at the figures in Europe especially, the far left violence is on the rise in sort of various different countries. And so I think it's something that needs to be taken seriously.
Right, and the far right have always had the Ku Klux Klan as their poster child, so that sort of puts them in a box. Where I think your book is also timely is that both of us have spent a lot of time in Southeast Asia and done our fair share of covering militancy, Islamic militancy, the Bali bombings. There are all sorts of dreadful stuff that occurred over the last 20 years. Now, it all seems to have gone away, and the security people are quite vocal behind the lines in saying that COVID has had a lot to do with that. With that came the security legislation and crackdowns of the like. It will come back. I don't think anybody thinks it's gone away forever. What do you think governments should be doing now? And I ask that in the sense that you've dealt with people of all different ethnic backgrounds who have come basically from Western countries and then been attracted to places like Syria, groups like ISIS. It hasn't gone away, and by all likelihood, it will return. That's what the security boffins are telling us. How do you think it will re-emerge, and what should governments be doing now, given the experiences, particularly from the late 1990s through till 2015, Syria and ISIS?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, because it's so important that people do not take their eye off the ball, because extremism, violent extremism, polarization, it hasn't gone away. It's got worse. And certainly you see that with so many different issues, that when something's a bit quiet for a couple of years, governments just like, oh, great, it's gone away. We don't have to worry about it anymore. But that's not the case. If we look at extremism, COVID and the impact of coronavirus lockdowns, they're going to be long lasting. It's going to have a huge impact on extremism, because coronavirus created exactly the kind of conditions in which extremism does thrive. So people felt lonely, they felt alienated, they felt mistrustful of what they're being told by their governments. They spent more time online, which is obviously a huge radicalizing force. So the conditions for extremism are there more than ever before, I would say. So I don't think we've seen the full impact of coronavirus on extremism. And in fact, the Buffalo shooting at the weekend in the Killer's Manifesto, he explicitly said, I went onto 4chan because I was bored during Corona. So there, he explicitly states that there was a link between the two. And I think we'll see it's the same across different ideologies as well, and in different countries, that has created these conditions. It hasn't gone away. When that starts to manifest itself, well, we just have to wait and see. But it does mean that governments have to not take their eye off the ball, and they have to not just look at it from a security perspective. Yes, they do. You do have to look at it from a security perspective as well, but you have to look at it from a societal perspective. What are those underlying reasons? Those feelings of loneliness, increase in mental health issues, depression caused by the coronavirus, problems with lack of funding, that's a huge one. All of these sort of pillars of society are the things that make people feel alienated. So you need to keep investing. You need to keep investing in those sort of pillars of society that make people feel like they belong. So that's, housing, mental health services, education, like really looking at your education systems. So it's really going into the nitty-gritty of the social structures that make people feel like they belong or don't belong. And it's a difficult one in a way, because these are huge issues that have sort of evaded sort of public solution for a very, very long time. So it makes it very difficult to say, well, you need to overhaul your education systems, you need to have much better housing systems, but these don't happen overnight. But I think it's really important that we recognize that these are contributing factors to extremism. Even if we know that we can't change that in the short term, the fact that governments, society, NGOs, people working in these sort of fields, people working in security even, take the time to understand what those reasons are, take the time to recognize that it isn't just about the ideology, it isn't just some angry young man, that there's all these other reasons. I think that is a really important first step, that recognition of the really multifaceted background to these people turning to extremism. And then you can start to think about how you tackle those things.
Your COVID analogy really it works well. I'm actually thinking of China. The complete and utter lockdown, particularly in Shanghai, that seems to be going on forever, and the zero case policy that the Chinese government seems to be looking for by many people is basically seen as an excuse to maintain security until after the China Congress in October, which they have every 5 years. But I was reading earlier today that China is cancelling events to be staged next year because of COVID. These are like sports events mid-late next year, which seems to indicate that how long are they going to lock down Shanghai for? What sort of alienation is that going to cause? It's quite an extraordinary decision to take, and you can only wonder what is going to come out of that, as you mentioned, the Buffalo shooting.
Yeah, the kind of dissent that government policies are creating is a really interesting one to follow, because we have seen opportunistic sort of nationalist parties and politicians really sort of getting on the sort of anti-vax, anti-lockdown bandwagon as well. And in a way, in COVID, we've seen quite a lot of mainstreaming of conspiracy and far-right narratives. And I think that's been really fascinating, that we've seen this sort of convergence of the sort of far left and the far right over coronavirus.
Yes, we have.
It's just this famous sort of horseshoe of politics where the far left and the far right end up closer together than the mainstream. And we've seen that in these societies. And I'm interested in the China example, of course, because then you've got a completely different system there. So where does dissent, and this is another really difficult one with looking at extremism, because there is legitimate dissent. And when does legitimate dissent make that pathway to extremism? Mm-hmm. It's a good thing to be able to question your governments. We have to have those opportunities to question our governments, which I take for granted here in the Netherlands, but of course people in China don't have that same opportunity to do that. So again, this is one thing that comes up again and again, is how do we encourage people to be questioning of their government's actions, to have a healthy level of dissent without tipping it onto that path to extremism? And I wonder if in countries where you can't openly voice dissent, then you don't have many other options. Going towards the more extreme is the only option you have when you want to have that dissenting voice. So that could be a potential consequence.
Well, this is another area, particularly in Indochina, which I made mention of before in previous podcasts. You've got the Mekong River in a 4-year drought. Fish catches have never been lower. Water levels have never been lower. The Chinese and Lao have been accused of hoarding water. You've got 65 to 70 million people living in that basin who rely on the fish catch for their source of protein. They survive hand to mouth, and there are quite a few security analysts who are putting the Mekong River Basin up there with the South China Sea as a potential flashpoint. I noticed your definition of terrorism, which the way I lectured at university about it, is basically a poor man's form of warfare, regardless of the cause. It's cheap and it's easy. It's a bag of chlorine. It's stuff you can buy in a hardware shop. Go out and blow up people and make a political statement. And the potential reasons for people to deploy this type of technique to get attention to governments that aren't listening.
Absolutely. I think that's a really interesting one. And you and I have both spent time in Afghanistan as well.
Indeed.
And there you have the situation where if you look at the Taliban and you would say, okay, the Taliban, extremists, why would people in the countryside support the extremists? But you need to understand what the needs of the people in a country are. And if the government isn't meeting their needs, they will look elsewhere to meet their needs. So it's not that people are terrorists or are violent extremists, but if you look in a situation where there's really dire conditions and the government isn't meeting the needs, people will look to other groups to meet those needs. So I think that there is a different context when we look at somewhere like Afghanistan, or we look at somewhere where you have insurgencies in very deprived areas where they don't have enough food to eat. I mean, that's a different circumstance to somebody radicalizing in the West. But underneath it all, again, there are some similarities, and that is that feeling of your needs not being addressed. And you have a whole sort of range there of how they're not being addressed, but the underlying feelings can be very much the same.
Right. In regards to 4chan, 8chan, these digital networks, how important were they and are they now? Do they still matter? They obviously played an important part in the characters you wrote about in their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these online forums, 4chan, you mentioned, I mean, one of the guys in my book, Matt Kapichanovich, he ended up being sort of self-radicalized because his mother had passed away when he was 17. He was feeling really alienated, really lonely. He was feeling really angry. And then he went on these chat boards, and there's loads of other really angry, mostly young men, and they're sort of spewing out this anti-Semitic, racist rhetoric. He said it was like that he sort of ended up spending 6-7 hours a day just looking at his phone, refreshing these threads on 4chan and just reading more and more of this hateful, racist, anti-Semitic, and also sort of ironic, sort of jokey content as well. And all of it indoctrinated him. So all by himself, sitting here looking at his phone, he sort of indoctrinated himself into this full white nationalist worldview without anyone ever knowing. And Mac is particularly interesting as well because his family were Bosnian Muslim refugees from the war in the former Yugoslavia who'd come to the United States. So this is a young kid with a Muslim background who ended up sitting there believing that migrants shouldn't be in America. So that was an extraordinary case for me, is how somebody can just self-radicalize all by themselves. And I think this content is still there. It's still on 4chan. Again, as you said, the Buffalo shooter was on 4chan. And then we could get into the whole discussion about the social media algorithms on YouTube, which send people to more and more extreme content. But I think what really worries me is that this idea that somehow this is going to stop. And I think we need to almost get rid of that idea, because this hate speech isn't going to go away. Even if you'd have to ban the internet entirely to get rid of hate speech. 4chan, maybe, you get 4chan to clean up. It's like something else will appear somewhere. I mean, hate speech, online polarization, this is with us to stay, really. So I think what's important is we look at how to inoculate young people against the hate speech that they will inevitably encounter. So I think, in a way, we need to start looking at that rather than every time we have these sort of acts. So like, online hate speech is awful, we need to get rid of it, which is true, but it's unrealistic. So let's look at it more holistically. How can we educate our young people today, our next generation, so that they can better separate fact from fiction, so that they can recognize hate speech, that they have the resilience and the strength to stand up to it when they see it. So I think we really need to start thinking about it in a different way, rather than, we need to keep the pressure on the social media companies. We need to sort of keep trying to get them to get rid of the hate speech, but we're unrealistic if we think that it's going to disappear entirely.
No, I think you're quite right. And so going back to Live Aid, television, and in those days we were told don't watch too much television kind of thing, and it was also new. But the way it's moved now is that the individual who can be angry can react to a major global event and go out and do something about it in his local community, which I don't really think the people who came up with the term think globally, act locally, I really don't think that's what they meant. But the other point being, though, is that at what point, and I do think it has changed, but only slightly, do the people who control and own these digital platforms accept responsibility and start behaving more like a traditional publisher, as opposed to pretending it's just a community pin-up board, and of course anyone can throw anything up there. I mean, they're making the money and at the same time absolving themselves of the rights and responsibilities that should go along with such a powerful tool to communicate.
Yeah, no, I think that absolutely that social media platforms like Facebook in particular should be made to adhere to the same standards as news publishers. That they should be responsible for their content, and they should be made to be responsible for their content. And that is up to governments and regulators. And is it going to happen? I don't know. There's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of activism on that front, and who knows? But I think that all of these things will make a big difference, because, you've just got all these platforms where things can be completely made up, and out they go, and people believe them now. And it's difficult to know how to address that. But I do think it was interesting that you mentioned this idea of TV. Then when we were kids, it was like, watching TV is dangerous. And it's the same thing with sort of, the video nasties and the sort of horror films that were out when I was a kid and a teenager, and everyone thought like watching Child's Play was going to turn us all into murderers on the television. Yeah. So you do have these moral panics. And what we see as a moral panic, I guess, reflects our generation and what we grew up with. So I do try and keep keep that in mind when thinking about freedom of speech on the internet and what's out there and how dangerous it is. That, like I said, that we look back and sort of laugh at the things that we were told were going to be terribly dangerous for us. So I think we've got to keep that in perspective and think about the positive aspects as well. We talked about voicelessness and this feelings of powerlessness, and the internet has allowed marginalised groups to mobilise and to have a voice in a way that they didn't before, and allows sort of connections that didn't happen before. So I think it is important to keep sight of the positives, because you can just get very, very pessimistic and depressed if you just look at it from that negative perspective.
And on that positive note, Charlotte McDonald Gibson, author of Far Out, Encounters with Extremists, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Luke. It's been a pleasure.
Voila.